One of the things that happens a lot in this job is I tend to walk into a game thinking I'll like it or I'll dislike it, and then I am proven right or wrong. Which I know sounds like duh, but I mean, it's always interesting to me, the process by which that happens. So I walked into Titanfall expecting to like it because I've heard nothing but praise for it. I walked out of it absolutely loving it. This is a really good game. I will say, with the advantage of hindsight and analysis, there are several aspects of it that could be better. But to use my own scoring system, it's more of an absence of a positive than a presence of a negative kind of a situation. So, not really many complaints there. I mean, considering how much of this team worked on the Modern Warfare's, the good ones, it doesn't really surprise me that this is as good as it is, but let's move on. One of the things that I talk about a great deal when it comes to FPSs is itemization. It's actually one of the weirdly lacking aspects of this game. But then again, the same thing kind of applies to most Modern Warfare games if you think about it, because what you're intended to do is kind of on-site procurement, right? You pick up the guns that the enemies use, and so by natural design, the itemization in this case is whatever the enemy happens to be using, and that's what you use, because that's what's available. Same thing here. Almost universally, I found myself being directed towards guns of the enemy, which I didn't actually care for, because that was what was available. Now, occasionally I'd get a really cool gun, and I'm like, ha! But what would happen is I'd run out of ammo, and there's no additional ammo, and so that's kind of the end of it. So there are several guns I didn't feel I could play with as much as I wanted to, even though there were good guns. The gun variety itself is good, as it is in most Modern Warfare games. Most of the guns play and feel differently, even though there's 3 different types of SMGs and 15 different types of automatic rifles and 700,000 types of different shotguns. Actual numbers might vary. They feel differently, right? By the way, the Massif, I think it was a shotgun, and the Hemlock were 2 of my favorite guns, as well as the double sniper rifle. I forget what that one was called. Those are probably my favorites overall, having gone through. Anyways, so yeah, that was cool, going through. Woo. The itemization is weird. The guns are weird, but good. And then we get to I suppose we should just go ahead and talk about the mechs, right? Wrong, because the next thing to actually talk about is the AI. So the AI is one of the hallmarks of games like this. We actually talked about this back in Modern Warfare's room. You need to have an enemy AI that isn't just good. It needs to be also bad. It needs to function like its own self-aware unit, which is making its own decisions based on what it can tell. Rather than, for example, you're in aggro, so the enemy knows where you are no matter where you are because the computer knows where you are. So, to use a direct contrast, back in Ion Fury, the encounter design was kind of how they would make these encounters interesting or fun, because it was all they could do. The moment you get into aggro, every enemy in aggro knows where you are instantly and perfectly, because it's the build engine. There's only so much you can do with that. Whereas in a game like this, you can make this guy know where you are, but this guy isn't, so he's still searching for you. He's trying to find you, and he might hear this guy and might think you're over here, and if you redirect, they both might go towards that direction, but you're actually over here now. And the introduction of not only the cloak, but something else I'll talk about in a minute, gives you options to do that. One of the first things I did in this game was I aggroed a dude, poked my head out, shot randomly in his direction, specifically didn't hit him, poked back in, cloaked, and ran around for a bit to see if he would keep firing, and let the cloak drop and just stood there, and he was still firing over where he thought I was, trying to put down suppressing fire. Stuff like that. I know that sounds strange to comment on, but giving the enemy units the inability to know everything perfectly actually really adds to what you can do tactically. It gives you options with how to approach each combat scenario, and that's what the Modern Warfare games usually do quite well, so props to that. I mentioned the cloak. The cloak is good. I like the cloak. The cloak is love. I barely used the cloak, admittedly. Really early on, I was like, all right, I'm going to sneak up in this guy and try an execution maneuver. And I kid you not, I bumped my foot against like a rock or something. And I guess because I was, I was there for too long, the detection thing went off and he was like, aha! But I like to think that what happened is he heard my foot go gunk on the rock and he turned around. I ended up having to shoot him. You know how it is. I could talk about arena design. There's generally good arena design, although that's more relevant in a minute. But there is usually multiple paths of progression and multiple ways to go forward. Decent cover, decent options, yada yada. Most of the usual good stuff that goes into a good arena design. It is designed to keep you pushing forward by the very nature of its flow. I could talk about the mechs. We're still not talking about that. But what I really want to talk about, what I'm sure most people want me to talk about, is actually the traversal mechanics. So one of the things that is critically important in an open world game, but also useful in other games as well, is how fun it is to go from point A to point B. So, I mean, most games don't really even think about traversal mechanics, and this is actually a flaw, if I might be bold, of probably about 80% of open world games. How do you get from point A to point B? Well, you walk there. Okay, that's not fun. That's not interesting. It effectively becomes filler. Now, some games get around that by having stuff to do on the way there. See Oblivion, for an example. Not a good example, but an example of that. But some games try to make it so that just getting from point A to point B is fun. It's enjoyable. To use probably the most example of this, Spider-Man on the PS4 made web-slinging and moving through the city just a mechanic and gimmick all on its own, and was just legitimately fun and enjoyable to do. So props on that. But there's plenty of other games that have done that. Even Grand Theft Auto 5, whose mechanic is driving, nevertheless did a lot with regards to how the other roads would be on, how the roads were designed, how the other cars would be on the road, how your car handles, and how the speed works and how it does loading. A bunch of little stuff to make driving fun, to make it interesting and enjoyable to go from point A to point B. I should also mention there's plenty of ways to get from point A to point B other than driving in GTA 5. You get the idea. But even in like a Shantae game where you could bounce off of a cannonball and then pull out a pirate's hat for a few bits, or in a game like Portal, for example, where you can fling yourself around and do that, traversal mechanics is something that's important. I'm saying all this because that is arguably one of the core mechanics of Titanfall 2. And I have no idea if it's in Titanfall 1 because we didn't play Titanfall 1. I should probably go ahead and give this proviso now. We didn't touch the Titanfall 2 multiplayer. Now, if you know Titanfall 2, you know why. And if you don't know, it's very simple. You can't. It's actually a fairly complex situation, but the bottom line is you cannot access Titanfall 1 or 2's multiplayer right now without using a third-party program. For the sake of the review, what we did was we made a big massive dividing wall between single player and multiplayer, and we said multiplayer is not a part of the review, which is not something I actually like to do when it comes to this sort of thing. But, I mean, getting around that was going to cause issues and problems. There is the North Star program, which is actually relatively recent, which is a way to bypass that issue. Point is, we didn't even look at multiplayer, which I'm only mentioning because, well, it very substantially changes the nature of how this game runs and plays. So all we did was the campaign. So getting around and moving around in the campaign was something that was going to be designed not just with an arena in mind, but there were several sections where were clearly the platforming sections, if that makes sense. This is the first thing I wanted to comment on about that. So I have seen several multiplayer matches back when you could actually do that. And the whole arena is kind of, a movement traversal arena. They didn't really do that in the single player section for the most part. In the single player section, it felt more like there are arenas, like I mentioned earlier in terms of design. And then there's platforming sections, and the two are connected, but you platform into the arena and then you arena into the platform and so forth and so on. Now that's fine. It's probably done because it would be insane to consistently design good arenas that also have platforming thing. It's basically map design for multiplayer at that point, like I said. But it makes sense that they would try to divide that wall. I only mention this because that's probably one of the only negatives, or rather absence of positives, that I could mention with regards to traversal, because traversal is awesome. I went straight from Ion Fury to this game. Ion Fury, for those of you who aren't keeping track with the streams or the rooms, is a build engine game which plays a lot like Quake 2. So movement in that is ridiculously fast and fluid. This game is like the exact opposite of that. It feels like you're walking around in a big, heavy suit, your jumps are floaty, and there's kind of a delay and a momentum to everything. Now, that's fine. That sounds like a complaint. It's not. I'm just mentioning the contrast, because when I first started, I was like, oh my god, that's going to take some getting used to, and it did. But once you get used to it, once you actually figure out how the game operates, you can do some absolutely stupid, ridiculous stuff with the momentum. Obviously, there's the wall running. But wall running doesn't even fully describe it. You get on the wall, and then you can jump off the wall, or you can jump at an angle, or you can angle onto the wall. You can actually jump back onto the wall you just jumped on. While you're moving on the wall, you have increased speed. You can sprint into it. You can jump off the wall while sprinting and then do a slide to jump onto another wall. You could pretty much chain actions through and to each other. And all of it is pretty much entirely on you and your overall skill. Most of the stuff that was mandatory in the single-player campaign was relatively low tier, relatively low intensity, with a few noteworthy exceptions. But for the most part, I mentioned that because it's not terrible. I'm saying this wrong. some of the actually ridiculous stuff you can do was not mandatory for the campaign. That's what I'm trying to say. So, for the most part, it was just, figure out the wall running, figure out the angles, figure out the speed, and go. There's some exceptions to that. Let's talk about the mechs really quick. I've kind of dodged around this. So, I was honestly expecting walking around in a mech to feel the same as walking around on a person, just with the camera a few feet higher. No, it felt very significantly different. The controls, they do what not very many games figure out. So there's only so many controls, honestly, even though this is a PC game, haha. There's only a couple of specific buttons. I rebound a few things, but you've got your grenade button, you've got your use button, you've got your utility button, right? What they would do, though, is they would make these be contextually different between the two, between being on ground and in the Titan, and then they would make it so that there's a degree of logic behind what does what, depending on which you're in. And I like that. T, which is what I rebounded to, was, I think that's middle mouse button. It always is going to be the defensive kind of ability, for example. Or G is always going to be this is what you use on regular cooldown kind of ability, like a grenade, or the G ability on the Titan, whatever it is, depending on your loadout, which is, of course, the other thing I wanted to talk about. The loadouts are cool. I kind of wish we could customize our loadout, mix and match. But at that point, we're just playing Mech Warrior, and while that is awesome, I still like the loadouts as is. In fact, I like the loadouts so much that when I was typing up my favorite loadouts, I noticed I had written like 5 loadouts down. I was like, which one's my actual favorite? I mean, honestly, I can't remember what it's called now. Blaze, I think? The fire loadout is probably my overall favorite. It's a little situational, so there's plenty of encounters where you probably shouldn't use that for that one. But one of my favorite little sections of that is I was fighting the second boss. The woman who's in the, what do you call it, simulacra. And I got right up in her face, popped the flame shield, which does damage every second, and just stayed there and held her there. Got a shot on her, which does a dot, because it's like a thermite shot. And then hit her with the G, which was a line thing. So she's on fire, while on fire, while on fire. And then I smashed up and meleeed her right in the face and got the execution. The whole thing maybe took 10 seconds tops from the boss intro to the execution animation, which is what I used for the thumbnail, actually. And that explains all I need to say about the mechs and how fun it is to play them in a nutshell. They're not invincible, which is good. But one of the things the game does very well is enemy mechs also drop health. Only enemy mechs, other stuff. Well, sometimes I notice the specters? No. The medium mechs, the not unarmed or unmanned mechs, sometimes drop stuff. But for the most part, you get your stuff either from manually placed items in the field, or you can steal them from other mechs if you're on the ground, or you could go and kill enemy mechs for a heal up. Which is good because it kind of helps produce flow. You move forward in order to heal, in order to move forwards, right? It also made the Ronin very fun, because at the Ronin, you just get right up in them and just bam, 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 dash behind them, bam, bam. Oh, it was quite enjoyable playing as Ronin, and I managed to get a fairly large amount of death happening as a direct consequence thereof. Ronin was fun, obviously. I also enjoyed Ion, which is... Ion's what I pulled out when I needed something to just plain die. But there's also the one, I forget what it's called. I think it's actually the North Star one. It's the sniper one. Now, that one's fun in its own right. So you hold the sniper rifle, you charge for a moment, and then you just destroy whatever's in your way, right? Except it's not a hit scan weapon. It's a projectile weapon, so enemies can dodge it. But it hits like a truck whenever it actually connects. And the ultimate is death from above, straight out of Overwatch. And I always was a Pharah player, so that actually worked out really well for me, because you can just pick an angle, pick a direction, and destroy whatever happens to be in your way as you're going that way. So good stuff. The usage of ultimates, the way you can charge ultimates by attacking, killing, and being hit. The overall system of having multiple cooldowns, like a dash cooldown. So you've got the dash ability, which you can go back and forth. You've got the G button I mentioned. You've got the defensive ability. You've got like a miscellaneous ability, which kind of varies, usually more utility-based. And of course, you've got the melee and your actual gun, which sometimes has an alt-fire mode. You've got decent kit per loadout, is what I'm trying to say. And you can swap loadouts on the fly, although you do have to suffer the animation of switching it out. But you can effectively pause the game by hitting F1, and then just switch the loadout and go back to it. So that's cool. And the whole thing's very well designed, for the most part. This is a good time as any to gush about one other thing about this game, before we really get into some of the meat of it. What's the HUD? I know this sounds like something that some of you will understand and some of you will not, but this is the first Modern Warfare game I have ever not given a negative for Raspberry Jam. It's only one point, it's only one thing to mention, but I mention it because it gets across how well designed the HUD is in this game in general. Most games have decent HUDs. Well, I shouldn't say most. There are several games. There are plenty of games that have a decent HUD design. You've got your stuff you need to know, and it's in a nice layout at the end, right? But most of those games, they'll do something like, for example, let's say I've got a cooldown ability over here. So it goes off, and then the button goes like this, then it slowly fills up, and then when it's full, there's probably a little flash, and then it's done. Cool. But I want you to imagine for a moment that you're in the middle of a very intense firefight with lots of fire and explosions going around everywhere. Now I want you to imagine that you are trying to pay attention to exactly when that cooldown's back because you need it. So that little bloop, that's all you get to see it. Now you can, obviously. But what this game does is there's like an audible notification, which is always a nice thing as well, but that there's also this like yellow that goes up along the left side of your screen directly above it. It's a really minor thing. It lasts for less than a second, but it's just... And that way, even if your attention is primarily over here on the screen, you're going to see that yellow line show up on the left side of your screen. I cannot believe how few games do this. I actually have an add-on over in World of Warcraft that allows you to do exactly this, to set up visual and audio indicators to say, hey, this has happened, either with regards to health or an ability being up or ability to be on cooldown or a dot falling off or whatever, right? There's several things you can track like that because most games don't offer that functionality. There's other things the HUD does well. I'm not going to go down the whole list, but this is a very well-designed HUD in general, and I'm actually very impressed with it. And that's important when you're playing a game like this, especially. Then we've got a couple of other things I could go down. I could talk about viscerality, which is definitely good. Most of the Titan guns feel awesome to shoot. There's like 3 sniper rifles I used in this game. I always use sniper rifles as kind of a gauge for viscerality. One of them has a weird, but it's understated. There's not a boom to it, but there's like a nice, and you could hear the bullet for several seconds after it fires kind of a thing. Then there's a sniper rifle, which just straight up has the boom, which is, of course, awesome. The whole thing, the Mastiff, the shotgun I loved so much, has a wonderful thing as it shoots out this line of death in front of you. Wonderful viscerality, good visuals, good movement, good guns, great AI, good arena design, great platforming, great traversal. It's just positives all the way down. But then the game really impressed me. So this is officially the point where I can't I can't talk about this without spoiling. So spoiler warning. So I get to a certain part in the game. It's a little over halfway, probably around I'd say it's probably about the halfway point of the mission or the game. And I get to this facility and I suddenly get warped into the past. Now, quick story, if you don't mind my indulgence. I know I already shared the story on stream, but whatever. Several years ago, I think 3 years ago now, I was watching a GDQ. And there was a speedrun of this game, which I was watching because I was curious, and I didn't know anything about Titanfall 2 at the time. I got to that scene the first time they did the time jump, and I remember sitting there watching the stream and I Alt F4'd it. I shut down the stream. The reasoning here, to explain this, is this is going to sound so stupid, I didn't realize that there was going to be something to spoil in the campaign of Titanfall 2. Knowing that there was, I immediately wanted to not watch it because I wanted to experience it for myself. I knew it was on the list and I knew I was going to play it someday for the show 3 years later. I think it might actually be 4 years. It's been a while, however long it's actually been. I can figure it out, but it doesn't matter. Point being, I have waited ever since then to figure out what happens in that mission. I managed to stay spoiler free the whole time. I've been on pause, come on, what happened? So we get to that mission. And we have a few tidbits, and there's lots of tiny little attention to detail. You could tell this is the section that really got the polish. It really got the time and effort to go back over it and over it and over to make it as codified and proper as it could. The one thing that everyone kept repeating is you can interrupt the guy's speech, and if you do the recordings in the present, actually acknowledge that, stuff like that. But the really, really cool thing is, of course, on the gameplay axis. Oh, the story's legit. I gave 2 positives to the story for this entire section. It's well presented. It's a wonderful mystery. It's tightly written. It's wonderfully built up. We get the audio logs. We get the visuals of both the past and the present. We see the disaster happening and has happened. There's the gargantuan pit of cryogenic corpses that have been experimented on to try and test this thing and see how it operates, because humans are expendable after all. This is also where we get the wonderful humans are expendable speech, which is... whew, not much else to add to that one. But from a gameplay axis, this mission was awesome. I cannot overstate this. I give a full 3 positives just for this one mission, which is the cap, if you're aware of the system. Because this is, it's not just cool and fun. It actually took existing mechanics and by the addition of this one little nuance, changed how they function. Let's say you're in the middle of a firefight with 5 dudes, and one of them puts down the shield and you're getting hurt and you gotta do something. What do? Time travel. You're in the present. You're fine. Pause, switch guns, reload, take a break, stretch, have a sandwich, go to the grocery store, watch a movie, come back, and then you could go back and it is the exact moment you left, because that's how that works. Because they're frozen for all intents and purposes, because, time isn't moving when you're not there. You get the idea. You jump back to the point which you jumped away from. So for them, no time has passed, but for you, it doesn't matter how much time has passed. That's how that works. And so, obviously, I'm kind of being a little facetious, but this made it so that the tempo of combat was determined by only one factor. You. You'll notice this is a running trend within this game. How Titan conflict goes depends entirely on how you play it. How the running and gunning and the traversal mechanic plays depends entirely on how you play it. You don't actually have to do most of the traversal except for the platforming sections if you don't want to. And how these temporal time-hopping sections go depends entirely on how you can just play it straight. You just go through the section, fight them. Or you can have fun with it. Or you could really screw with them. One of the things I did on camera was I killed this whole section of people, and I left one dude alive. Then I warped out and was like, hi. Then I warped away. Got behind him. Warped in. Waited for him to see me. Hi. Warped away. Got back behind him. Poke. And I just did this 5 or 6 times before finally I killed him with his own pistol. I've actually had an idea in my head for a while of a game where the main mechanic is that you have teleport abilities. In the way I envision it, it would play very similar to this. The difference is it wouldn't be time travel, so you wouldn't be hopping destinations. You'd basically freeze the game except for yourself, reposition, unfreeze, and then that would be your teleport, right? And there'd probably be a cooldown and some other balancing mechanics to make it not ridiculously overpowered, but you get the general concept, right? It's funny how similar to that this played, especially since there's wonderful little quality of life features as you're going. Obviously, there's a lot of visual indication on colors and angles with regards to what you should be looking at and where, which makes perfect sense because Modern Warfare 2 did the exact same thing, and I'm pretty sure it's the same team. But one of the other things they do, and I love this, is anytime you temporally shift, there's a blue, glittering flame that just sits there for a second that indicates where an enemy was in the timeline you just left. Doesn't matter which one it is. So you have an idea of where the enemy is for it only sits there for a few seconds, but it gives you a chance to reposition and to think about your maneuvers. And of course, that's just from the pure combat perspective of things. This is probably the best platforming section of the entire game. I'd say the other thing would be the radar dish would be the other one that probably equates that. Because you have to do platforming while temporally shifting while platforming in between the 2 timelines in order to progress in multiple areas. And there's a wonderful escalation to it as well. And it's just kind of generally awesome. I don't really have a simpler way to put that. It's just, and then over here, because in the past this thing was here, and then in the future this thing is here, and then in the past this thing is here. And you just kind of bounce back and forth between the walls until you land on the one platform which wasn't there in the past, but that's okay because you're going to jump off it back into the present. Now there's this fire over there, but that's okay because you can go into the past in order to go past it. The design on display here is mind-bogglingly good. It is absolutely the peak of the entire game. Now, I will admit, the gameplay did level off a little bit after this. It was still good. Let's be very clear. Probably the best traditional platforming section was the aforementioned radar dash. Also, not just the radars, but when you're going down through the power section to fill that up, that's really cool too, with the vents and all that. That's awesome. I'm sorry. Gotta do it right. But it's still good, and that's important. Right up until you get to the hyper beam moment. Now, hear me out for a second. So, for those of you who have never heard me use this phrase before, and I keep being told I need to repeat myself in every video and not assume people have seen every video I've done before, or any video I've done before. So, if you're new to the show, hi. I'm an idiot who's bald and stupid. Actually, not bald, I shave, but whatever. The hyper beam moment is a concept where You give the player something awesome. It's almost universally a gameplay thing. Very, very rarely there is a narrative hyperbeam moment. It has happened. There are a few examples where this happens. I can think of an example in Ace Attorney 1. Ace Attorney 1. I can think of an example in, Tyranny by Obsidian. There are a few examples, but generally speaking, this is a gameplay conceit. What it is here's something awesome. Now, hang on, it's not that easy, because then you have to design the section wherein the player can play with the awesome thing. You give them the awesome thing, you give them the section to have the awesome thing in. Usually this happens towards the end of a narrative, towards the end of a game. It's named because of the hyper beam in Super Metroid, which you get after you have beaten the final boss, for example. There are several examples of this, Half-Life 2 and the Mega Gravity Gun. And of course, now I can't think of any other examples. There's a lot of examples, right? The reason I bring all this up is in this game, we get to this point where we're dead and we're horrible and it looks like BT is dead and BT is awesome. And that's unrelated. It's related. So we pull out his core and we pull out his survival kit. It's like, okay, what's the survival kit? Well, it's a smart gun and a knife. Okay. That doesn't seem too awesome. The way a smart gun works is... And if you ever want to be terrified, I actually did a little looking into this. They are trying to figure out how to make this kind of technology work in real life. Don't think about that too much. Anyways, so the way a smart gun works is, here's your overall view, right? Anything within this chunk of the view, so probably about half of the overall space of your screen, almost all of which is in the center. Well, I mean, you know what I mean? It's this broad chunk of the center, so everything except for the edges. Anything in that range, it will lock onto, and when you hit shoot, it will shoot them and kill them. You have infinite ammo for this section, and this whole section is designed to be a massive platforming section with swarms of enemies. Now that may sound horrible, but keep in mind you can shoot while platforming, and because you don't really have to aim, you can point in the direction of the enemies and just kind of gun them down en masse without ever losing pace or stride. Just racing through, absolutely loving the aforementioned traversal mechanics in a level completely designed around it while gunning down dozens of the enemy effortlessly. That's a hyper beam moment. The only downside is it is pretty damned brief. It is just... And then you get your Legion Titan, which is awesome, don't mistake me. But... Holy crap. So that's awesome. And then the final mission kind of peters out. In fact, I was really disappointed by the final boss fight, because the final boss fight against Random Woman, I'm going to deliberately not mention her name, even though I do remember it, because who cares? We only met her twice before in 2 scenes, each of which lasted like 6 seconds. So Random Woman is there, and she's like, I'm evil for absolutely no reason. It's like, okay, cool. So we go to fight her, and she has HP barriers. Now, if you've never heard me describe this really quick, so let's say a boss has 3 health. Hear me out. Let's say you have an attack that does 2 damage. So you manage to do 2 damage, and what happens is they lose 1 health because they have an HP barrier at this point, at their 2 health point. And then they go do their scripted event. I will script, and I will do all this scripted stuff. And then their HP bar can be hit again. And then you hit them down to 1 health, another script, and then they're dead. And this is the most common pattern. I used simplified numbers, but that is the pattern. There's usually 3 phases to any kind of HP barrier boss. This can be used well. I don't think this is an example of it. Anybody on stream can attest to the fact that I flat out killed her the second time, and I came very close to killing her the first time, and both times I hit the HP, well, the first time I almost hit the HP barrier. The second time I did hit the HP barrier. She was just sitting there at 1 HP until she teleported away in order to summon some ads and then come back and fight me, and it's like, okay, so that was just kind of disappointing and disinteresting. Then BT died. I said spoilers earlier. The narrative of this game isn't super awesome. I know that's a weird way to phrase that. It is good. There are very few things I have to complain about the narrative. But one of my only complaints is that most of the characters aren't. They're just kind of there. There's not a lot of character to the game. The one huge exception to that is BT himself. BT is absolutely the main protagonist of this game, and absolutely the hallmark of the game. There's a reason why even when you're separate from him, you're always hearing him in your mic. He is the consistent presence, the predominant voice actor for the entire work, and the actor does a wonderful job of it, by the way. BT is awesome. He is, in fact, Loaderbot 2.0 in many ways. Or was Loaderbot after this? I'm not actually sure of the timeline. Anyways, the point being, so one of the things fiction likes to do is the fake out reveal or the fake out moment. So let's say that you have a story, and in this story, the main character dies. Oh my gosh. But you want that to have impact, but you also want to build up to it. And if you build up to it, people are going to see it coming. So one of the things you can do is you can build up to the moment and then have a fake out. Maybe they don't actually die. Maybe something else happens. Maybe someone else dies. And it's like, oh my God. There's lots of ways to do this kind of fake out. When I say fake out, I should mention that you don't actually have to do a fake out. It doesn't have to be a fake moment. For example, in the aforementioned example, let's say you're building up the protagonist to dying and the protagonist's lover dies. Oh no. And that's the big moment. And you treat it like the big moment. So that could work too. The whole point of this type of thing, though, is it's to get the audience off their guard. Because if they see it coming, it doesn't have quite the same impact. Right? So you want them to you want it to kind of come out of left field. You want there to be some impact, some shock value to that. So we have BT die, but then we get him back in a super mega mech and we're awesome. And then BT dies. You can see the consequence here. Now, this is a more traditional fake out, like I mentioned earlier, and I think that's part of why it doesn't hit quite as well. And I absolutely saw it coming, especially since, the moment the mech started going, and of course he mentioned, I have done the math. I was like, oh, gotcha. And despite all of that, you're probably expecting me to be all cynical and all bitter. And I had to hold back tears. I was just sitting here quietly while the cutscene, there's actually a platforming section right after the big sacrifice, which is a good way to distract the player. By the way, that's a nice technique. Give them a gameplay section so that they don't quite have time to process what just happened. And I'm just sitting here going, oh my God, BT! And the way he said it was so beautiful too. Right? We got those 3 rules. We got the 3 priorities, right? You gotta link, you gotta do the mission, and you gotta protect the pilot. And he did it. He actually did all 3. And he did it beautifully. And of course, Typhon was absolutely destroyed by that. I wonder who built that thing, by the way. Has that been answered in Apex Legends? Because I haven't looked into the lore of Apex Legends, because why would I? I got other things to look at right now. And I know I could talk about other things story-wise. I could talk about how ridiculously, monumentally wasteful the IMC is, or the IMS, whatever, because of the fact that they're able to hollow out a mountain. Stop. Right there. That's all I need to say. Any of you who has any understanding of physics or engineering or demolitions knows that the phrase hollow out a mountain is all you need to say to demonstrate that someone has a ludicrous, and I want to stress this, a ludicrous amount of infrastructure, resources, and power on a technical, and engineering level. But they hollow out a mountain to turn the whole mountain into an engineering a factory line in order to build scenarios to test their bots. Oh my, we're going to be playing FF14. I'm still going to be talking about the waste on display with that. That's just mind-boggling. I could talk about that. I could talk about how the the 6-4, they're cool. Totally would sign up. I could talk about the mercs and how they were kind of generic. There's not much to say about that. The other mercs, the Apex Predators. I could talk about how there's some decent banter in several scenes. I could talk about how there's a lot of really cool moments that I really talk about, like, boarding an enemy ship and then guiding it around and then accidentally your way into the other ship. I could talk about how we destroy a planet towards the end of the game. Again, who built that thing? But ultimately, I feel like the BT moment, BT himself, and BT sacrifice are the narrative core. So I've talked about this concept a few times before. It's actually a pillar is a better way to phrase it. It's a pillar. And a narrative pillar is something around which everything else revolves around. Now, not every story does this. In fact, most stories don't. But a story that has a strong narrative pillar can rotate everything else around this, narratively speaking. Most of the other events and characters and plot points are all defined by how they react to this. And BT is absolutely that pillar of this game's story. Our story of Cooper, Matt Mercer, all revolves around our interactions with BT and how we kind of accidentally into and then out of his life. And yes, I saw the mid-mission credits thing. We'll see if a Titanfall 3 ever happens. That's a whole other bundle. most of the events of trying to accomplish mission objectives happen because of or as a result of his thing. I mean, let's go through the shortcuts thing, you know? Most of the sequencing of the story happens because of or directly related to him. And it's kind of awesome the way they pull it out, because what that means is the central pillar for this entire story is a person for all intents and purposes. Although I personally don't actually think BT is an AI. I think he would be more qualified as a VI. I'm not going to define that right now because that would take like 10 minutes. The point is, I'm not sure he was at the full level of sentience and sapience. I think he's a bit lower than that. But that doesn't make him any less of a character, and it doesn't make him any less impressive. In fact, if I can be so bold, it is very impressive what they were able to do and how much feeling they were able to evoke with something that was effectively at dog-level intelligence. Because, you know, I've seen plenty of fiction which isn't able to make you give a damn about someone who is at human level intelligence. So good freaking job on the development and style of BT. I guess that's about all I got for this one. This is, for all intents and purposes, been our FPS block. We've got 2 more kind of FPSs coming up. We're playing Prey 2017, and we're playing System Shock 1, which are kind of FPSs, but for the most part, this has been the FPS block. I do hope you've been enjoying, and I will be seeing you all next time.